Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the Pork Queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and today I'm joined by Laura Belin, publisher, editor of The Bleeding Heartland. Thank you so much for joining me, Laura. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, in the title, you may have heard that the leader of the free world must pass through Iowa, but that might be changing, and that's why Laura's here today. But before we get to that, have you subscribed yet? You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeart, all the podcast players, and make sure if your podcast tool has one of those rating things that you give us 5 stars. Would really appreciate that. Okay, now, Laura. So you're a progressive news source in Iowa. What is the website? Let's give that out at the top of the show here real quick so people can find it.
www.bleedingheartland.com. There is also a Bleeding Heartland Facebook page, and I'm on Twitter at Laura R. Belin.
Awesome. So 50 years of the Iowa caucuses. And Iowans are pretty used to being first. We're pretty used to this very close access to our politicians. And I mean, that's basically over. I mean, the Republicans still have the caucuses, but Iowa as the caucus institution is essentially over. So, I mean, the big question is, what the heck just happened?
Well, we're going to be on 2 tracks now. This is going to be very strange because the Republican caucus campaign is proceeding as usual with lots of candidates coming here, speaking to local conservative groups, doing fundraisers for Republican candidates. And that's going to continue this year because the Republican National Committee has made clear that they have no interest in changing the calendar. But of course, the Democratic National Committee's Rules and Bylaws Committee just voted to recommend a completely different calendar. Iowa would not be one of the early states. And in fact, candidates who campaign in Iowa would be penalized. So it may not matter that much next year, assuming Joe Biden runs for re-election. There probably wouldn't have been much of a competitive Democratic caucus campaign anyway. But going forward, if the Democratic Party maintains a calendar that doesn't have Iowa as an early state and Republicans try to keep the calendar the way it's always been, it could be a real mess.
Yeah, and you threw a lot of really juicy details in there and a lot of stuff we're going to get into. But as I travel around, everyone, you say you're from Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa, most people kind of give you this like, where's that again? But then you're like, Iowa caucuses, everyone, no matter who I talk to, everyone lights up. And they're like, oh, the Iowa caucus, like it's a national institution. So I'll be honest, like I'm super biased. I grew up here. I still live here. I haven't lived in Iowa my entire life, but it really does hurt because it is an institution if the Republicans and the Democrats do it. But if both parties don't do it, Iowa certainly in a big way loses, I wouldn't say half its status. It kind of loses its major status as the conduit. I mean, that's even how this show starts. Like the tagline to this show is the president, the leader of the free world has to pass through here. And that's really not going to be the case anymore. So the weird thing that I don't fully understand is that like the DNC is making this decision, or they've made a recommendation. We'll get into that here in a bit. But apparently this somehow conflicts with New Hampshire law and Iowa law. How is that going to work itself out?
That's right. Well, first of all, it is disappointing for a lot of people. I grew up, I loved going to events where I could meet candidates. I met Joe Biden in somebody's living room in Urbandale in 1987. Yeah. The first time he was running before he dropped out. He dropped out before the 1988 caucuses. And I met him again in a West Des Moines house party in 2007. And it's a great opportunity, or it has been, for Iowans to meet the candidates. And Republicans will still have that, at least for the next cycle. But that is going away for Democrats. And it's very sad. So Iowa and New Hampshire have these state laws. These have never been tested in the federal courts. And I've seen lawyers say this would not hold up if anyone tried to go to court on this. But New Hampshire's law says they have the first primary, and they will move, their Secretary of State can move the date of their primary to before any other state has a primary. Iowa law says that we hold a caucus 8 days before the first caucus or primary for the purposes of presidential selection in another state. That's not the exact legal wording, but that's basically what it says. So we've had this long arrangement with New Hampshire where we have our caucus and 8 days later they have their primary. And so the problem for Iowa Democrats is the DNC can approve this calendar, but we have to hold caucuses early in 2024. I mean, the Republican-controlled legislature is not going to change the state law. And so the Democrats have to have some kind of a precinct caucus to elect county convention delegates and people to the platform committee and that sort of thing. But it's not going to be a meaningful caucus like it has been in the past when we've had lots of presidential candidates here trying to drum up support.
Yeah, because as you alluded to here just a moment ago, the DNC put penalties in this recommendation, and it sounds like they're going to, if Iowa or New Hampshire, I mean, basically follow our own laws, there are going to be penalties applied against our states, right?
Yes. Well, the penalties, I think the main penalties are going to be applied to the candidates. So anyone who hires staff here or gives speeches here or spends money on advertising here would potentially be penalized, would lose delegates. And there's a chance, although apparently it's not written into the rules yet, but the DNC chair has the authority to impose other sanctions. And one of those could be excluding those candidates from televised presidential primary debates. That would be obviously a really huge problem, and it would deter people. I mean, we have to hold a caucus under the state law. And yes, probably the DNC will impose a sanction on Iowa that will lose some of our Democratic National Convention delegates. That, again, probably won't be as meaningful for the 2024 cycle if Joe Biden runs for re-election, because his renomination is going to be probably a foregone conclusion. So the DNC convention delegates aren't the big deal. But the big deal is not having the candidates here doing fundraisers, drumming up attendance for Democratic Party events. I mean, think about big events like what used to be called the Jefferson Jackson Dinner, that's now called the Liberty and Justice Celebration. That was a major fundraiser for the state Democratic Party, or the Polk County Democrat Steak Fry, where they would get thousands of people coming to hear presidential candidates. That's just a big problem, that Democratic organizations in Iowa are not going to have that kind of a draw anymore.
Right. I mean, the Iowa Democrat chair, Ross Wilburn, he said that, well, hey, that's great, everybody. We're going first anyway. So, when I see someone impose penalties, right off the bat, that my first thing is wait, whoa. Why is that necessary? Why do we have to come out swinging right away? Are there some deep divisions over this?
Well, they did the same thing. A lot of people don't remember this, but in 2008, Florida and Michigan tried to jump ahead of the line and go ahead of Iowa and New Hampshire, and they ended up losing quite a bit of their convention delegates. In fact, Barack Obama took his name off the ballot for the Michigan primary because he didn't want to be in violation of the calendar. And I didn't hear any Iowa Democrats complaining about how unfair it was that the DNC was putting sanctions on Michigan for trying to jump the line and violate the calendar. So, I mean, the parties, there is a lot of case law that political parties can manage their own nominating process. They can make up whatever rules they want. They can have whatever calendar they want. So regardless of what it says in Iowa and New Hampshire state law, the Democratic Party nationally does not have to follow that. Now, Ross Wilburn, he's in a pretty terrible position because he can't come out and say, oh, well, of course, we'll follow what you say and violate Iowa law. He can't do that. We do. Again, there still will be precinct caucuses here, even if Democratic presidential candidates aren't campaigning. I've gone to those caucuses in the off years when there's no presidential campaign, and it's usually very small, 5 or 10 or 20 people perhaps in a precinct instead of 100 or 200 or 300 people. And you just deal with the party business, vote on platform resolutions, vote on people to serve on various committees. And it's kind of a nice small neighborhood gathering, but it's not the caucuses the way we know them and the way the media have covered them for all these years.
Right. So the DNC rules and bylaws made the recommendation with the calendar. Of course, South Carolina leading, Nevada, New Hampshire, Georgia, and then Michigan. But I think there's a little bit of confusion, certainly not by you or by people who are familiar with it, but there's a little bit of confusion, I would say, from the general voting public that this actually has to be voted on by the full committee in January. So what are the chances that fails?
Well, it probably will be tweaked a little bit because I don't think there's any hope of Iowa being restored to the early group in January. But this plan is contingent on several states altering their state law in order to maintain their spot. They might have to move the primary date. And in the case of New Hampshire, they would have to allow early voting, which New Hampshire now has almost no early voting. And I mean, the Republican controlled legislature and Republican governor of New Hampshire are not going to rush to pass a bunch of laws just because the DNC told them to. So it's possible that
Yeah.
what the full Democratic National Committee votes on in January may look somewhat different from the plan that the Rules and Bylaws Committee approved late last week. But I think either way, Iowa is not going to be part of it. That President Biden said that their caucuses should not be part of the presidential selection process. It should be only primaries and only in states where they have a relatively few barriers to voting. And Iowa law says we have to have a caucus. We can't have a primary. That's a result of this decades-long alliance we've had with New Hampshire. And it served us well in 1984. I hear a lot of old timers say, well, in 1984, they threatened sanctions and they backed down from that. Well, it's not the 1980s anymore. I mean, Iowa and New Hampshire don't have the clout that they had at that time. And in the Democratic Party, certainly, there are louder voices now for having more representative states start the presidential nominating process. And I don't think there's any way that that's not going to go through. It wouldn't surprise me if the calendar they end up voting on in January is a little bit different. It may not have Nevada and New Hampshire the same day, for instance. And I don't know what's going to happen exactly with South Carolina and their date. But it will look probably pretty close to what the Rules and Bylaws Committee approved last week.
I mean, there is a chance, though, right? There is a chance, right? Like, because I think back to when President Obama won Iowa, right? Iowa put him on the map, and he had a lot of really positive things, to say about Iowa. Of course, that's how Joe Biden got in the White House initially, as Iowa. So, and I don't anticipate President Obama going against Joe Biden on this. But I mean, is there a chance that there is some Save the Iowa Caucus thing? Do we hear from, because we've already heard from some prominent Iowa Democrats, at least, of course, also Scott Brennan, the only Iowan on the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee, who said this, leaves out rural voters, which I'll ask you about. But is there a chance that there's some initiative that saves the Iowa caucuses, or do you not see that?
I really don't think so. Usually when there's a sitting president in office, the DNC defers to what the president wants. And it's fairly clear that Joe Biden does not want caucuses to be part of the process. He's not interested in starting the process in overwhelmingly white states. And by the way, South Carolina is about as rural as Iowa. I think it's about 34% of the South Carolina population lives in rural areas and 35% of the Iowa population. So I get that there's this rhetorical thing that the Democrats are turning their backs on rural America. But the truth is that South Carolina has a lot of rural areas. There are a lot of rural voters, even in places like Michigan and Georgia. So it's really not, I don't think it's likely that there's going to be any kind of a Save Iowa effort. Iowa and New Hampshire are kind of on a limb right now, all on their own.
It could be said, though, like South Carolina, New Hampshire, Georgia. I mean, 3 of the early voting caucus primary states are basically East Coast. Nevada is not quite West Coast. And then I know that I think Scott Brennan was basically saying Michigan isn't technically Midwest. So does this kind of play, or is there some angle here where Iowa Democrats say, hey, this is the coastal elites versus the Midwest, or not?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Iowa Republicans are already saying that. I'm sure somebody
I'm
will
sure
say
they
that.
are.
I mean, Georgia, you could call it an East Coast state. I think it's really the South is what it is. And I heard people say it should be Minnesota, not Michigan, because Minnesota is more of an upper Midwest state. Michigan is more of the Rust Belt rather than a true Midwest state. You can argue about that. I personally believe that South Carolina is in there because the South Carolina primary in 2020 gave such an important boost to Joe Biden that he wouldn't want to eliminate them from the early states. But it wouldn't surprise me, for instance, if in 2028, when Joe Biden probably isn't going to be calling the shots for what the DNC does, it wouldn't surprise me if Georgia just supplants the position of South Carolina and that we have 4 early states East, West, South, and some kind of Midwest Rust Belt without South Carolina being in the mix. South Carolina isn't really a swing state. It's not competitive in the general election, but it's there right now because it was so important to Joe Biden.
And that's a good point, right? Like, I think that plays into this. Obviously, it sounds like you may agree as well, but like, how much of this is because Biden's just ticked off? Like, he finished 5th in 2008, he finished 4th in 2020, and then, of course, in New Hampshire, which has a primary, he finished 5th. So is this a risk for his campaign because it makes him look small? Like, does he just look like he's ticked off and he's like, you know what, screw you, Iowa?
I don't think so, because I think that even before the Iowa caucuses happened, there was a strong movement within the DNC to not start the process in a caucus state and not start the process in an overwhelmingly white state. Iowa and New Hampshire are not representative of the demographics of the country, and they're definitely not representative of the demographics of the Democratic base of the party. And so you can say, yeah, well, if Joe Biden had won the Iowa caucuses, he might view it differently, like Barack Obama. I mean, there were people on the DNC who wanted to upend the calendar in 2012. And of course, Barack Obama being president, he wasn't going to have any talk of that. So that never materialized into a serious effort. But there have been people on the DNC who have criticized this calendar for a long time. And as Joe Biden said in the letter that he wrote to the Rules and Bylaws Committee last week, that we've had many good candidates over the years drop out when, after only 2 states have voted, states that 99.8% of Black Americans don't live in. So it's very important for the Democratic Party to give people of color a voice. And I think that is animating it. I mean, some people may say this is just Joe Biden's revenge against Iowa and New Hampshire. But on the DNC, there were already lots of people who felt this way before Biden became president.
Does this backfire at all? What do you think the chances are of that happening? Like, from a Midwest standpoint, where people are like, you know what? I don't think Biden cares about because, you know, you and I both know that the Democrats recently have struggled with rural voters. So does this increase that struggle? Like, do they kind of look like they're retreating from rural America?
Well, again, that will certainly be the talking point. It's not going to be helpful to Iowa Democrats for the National Party to be retreating from competing here. I mean, the truth is that they will be competing in lots of other states that have rural populations, but that is not going to change the fact of how people view this move and how people portray the move. So Iowa Democrats have struggled over the last decade. 5 of the last 7 general elections have been Republican landslides. And so this isn't going to help the party come back from that brink. But I also don't think it's the main factor. There are lots of things going on here. But when Iowa Democrats are looking at trying to rebuild the party without the organizing boost and the fundraising boost that comes from the caucuses, and with Republicans continuing to enjoy all of those advantages, it just starts to look very difficult. Yeah,
and what you said there was key too, kind of the red state, blue state thing. Like Iowa, for most of when I was growing up, was a purple state, right? It was a swing state. It was highly competitive, and it seems like it's probably no coincidence that after the nation was supposed to get whomped, right? The Democrats throughout the country were supposed to get whomped in the midterms and didn't happen at all. And Iowa, though, went the other way. There was kind of a red tsunami in Iowa. So I'm sure that kind of plays into this.
Definitely it does. And Iowa, for a state that's overwhelmingly white, it's really surprising that we were a swing state for such a long time. I looked back after the 2020 election, I went back and looked at the presidential results in Iowa going back several decades. And from 1992 to 2012, the presidential popular vote in Iowa was so close to the national popular vote. 6 presidential elections in a row. I mean, what are the chances? It was very strange and unlikely. And then in 2016 is where Iowa started to really diverge. So Trump carried Iowa by 9 points in 2016, even though he lost the national popular vote. And then in 2020, even more extreme, because Trump lost the national popular vote by even more, and yet still carried Iowa by 8 points. So Iowa is not looking like a swing state, and it's not looking reflective of how the national voting is. Right. And we can talk about a lot of the different reasons. I don't think everybody has come up with a great unifying theory of this, but a lot of it relates to the demographics of Iowa and how different groups of voters have drifted away from the Democratic Party.
Right. And, I think because it's been here for so long, the Iowa caucuses, and I want to get your perspective on this because maybe this is just like my own viewpoint, but I feel like because Iowans have had this for so long, and I work at a co-working space like right in the middle of downtown Des Moines most days. And it is a normal conversation in that co-working space during caucus time, which, happens every 4 years, but now will, happen maybe every 8 years or, but it's a very normal conversation at that co-working space for someone to say, hey, Bernie's down the street, or hey, Hillary's down the street. Who wants to go say hi? Like, that is a normal thing here. And so yes. Iowans are just used to the fact that they have this much access, and they pretty much count on it every 4 years that they get to grill these candidates. They get to, the candidates aren't yet insulated by layers and layers of PR people and distance. They're very accessible. They're very vulnerable. And Iowans just seem, and this is what I want your opinion on, are Iowans just really good at asking pointed questions that throw people off and really start national conversations? Or do you think that same environment will happen at any other state?
I do think that Iowans ask good questions. I've been to so many Iowa caucus events, and I've seen this again and again, that when the ordinary voters or caucus goers ask questions, they ask really substantive, policy-based questions. And then the national press following the candidates around are always asking some horse race question or something about the latest poll or the latest fake outrage. And I do think that Iowans, they take this role of vetting the candidates seriously, and they do give people a fair hearing, even people who aren't the front runners in the national polls. And that was always one of the best arguments for starting the process here, was that it was a relatively inexpensive state to campaign in, and Iowans really did listen to everybody. I think that voters in other states can adapt and can learn to do that. I mean, you could argue that this is part of the culture that we've had for decades here, and that developed over a long time, and it may not happen right away next year in Georgia or Michigan. But I don't think that Iowans are that special that there's no way that ordinary voters in other states could ask candidates good questions. The real issue is accessibility, and the caucuses just weren't that accessible. If you look at the participation, even when the presidential campaigns were investing enormous resources here and trying to get people out for the caucus, and then there would be other primary states where there was hardly any campaign infrastructure and hardly any door knocking or phone banking. And yet they would have this massive turnout for their primary because the barriers to voting in a primary are just so much lower than a caucus. And I think that was the biggest strike against us all along, was that a caucus is just not that easy to take part in. And the Democratic Party, which argues for access to the ballot box in every other context, just didn't want to support starting the presidential campaign in a place where you have to be in a room at a specific place and time for an hour or two or three.
Yeah, no. So one of the interesting things about the culture here, and I think it is a culture here, right? I think like the ability to talk across the aisle, talk politics is unique here. Now, sure, that could change, but man, 50 years of history is a heck of a thing to turn around. I remember the first time I asked this question, but I was in an Uber, I think in New York, and something about, of course, people, where are you from? Des Moines, where's that? Iowa, where's that? Is that a state? When was that? And I think he asked, we got to the point of talking politics, and he's like, whoa, hold up. You talk politics and you're like, just with people? You do that? And I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah. Is this not a normal thing? He's like, no, we barely talk politics with our families here. Like, you don't talk politics. That's like, you don't do that. And I just thought everybody did that. So now whenever I travel, no matter where I am, I ask that question. And it seems like it's a very rare thing that Iowans talk politics. Is that just because, maybe you don't know the answer to this, Laura, but is that just because we have that image, or is that just the Iowa nice thing? We're willing to talk. Do you have any thoughts on that? Otherwise, we'll move to other topics.
Say it's a subculture of Iowa that talks politics a lot. Remember, there are hundreds of thousands of Iowans who have never attended a caucus and never will attend a caucus and aren't really reached by the candidates. But there is this highly engaged subculture. And Pat Reinert, who runs the Iowa Starting Line website, he wrote something about this over the weekend, that so many people who work in politics, not just in Iowa, but nationally, many people got their start as a field organizer working on somebody's Iowa caucus campaign. And it's always been considered a really good thing to have on your resume because you've got to do the work. Iowa voters or caucus goers are considered to be highly engaged and discerning. And so it is part of the culture here, but it was never a mass thing that everybody in Iowa did.
Well, Hollywood's going to need to retool all their political dramas because there are always Iowa jokes. Well, good Iowa jokes, not mean ones. But Iowa is always in there. They're always talking the Iowa caucuses. They're always saying when you travel to Iowa or who's going to Iowa in like every political drama, every political comedy. So everyone's going to have to get new jokes, and everything's going to have to change.
The Republican campaign is going to go on as usual. So we'll have the parade of candidates at the Iowa State Fair next year, and lots of things. So I think there's still going to be fodder for some Iowa jokes.
Not as many, though. Okay, so the one last thing I wanted to end on was, does this have anything to do with like that computer app thing that happened years ago? Like, is this kind of a black eye in the Iowa Democratic Party, and so the National Party kind of wanted to separate, or is that not a factor?
That didn't help, for sure. I don't think that's as big a factor as what many people talk about. But a lot of people don't remember, in 2016, there was a lot of confusion. It was such a close race between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And there were a lot of questions about the results from some precincts. And then in 2020, the Iowa Democratic Party said, we're going to have this app. We're going to get all the reports. We're going to report the head counts as well as the delegate counts, and we're going to have a clear winner. And then it all collapsed because the app malfunctioned, and it took a long time. And then even when they did sort through all the results, it still wasn't that clear. It was a very close race between Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. And so that didn't help. I think that all of this was already in the works before that happened, because Julian Castro, who was a presidential candidate in 2019, he was leading the charge and talking about how Iowa and New Hampshire are not representative and should not go first. And there was a lot of support nationally within the Democratic Party that we should be starting in states that look more like America and look more like the Democratic base. And so then when it looked like we can't even manage our caucus competently, it doesn't help. But I think even if that app hadn't malfunctioned, I think we'd still be in the same situation, because Joe Biden did poorly here. Caucuses are difficult to participate in, and the Democratic Party would be looking elsewhere.
And I will say, to the Iowa Democratic Party's compliment or defense, I think, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but they were only given like 2 weeks from the Democratic National Committee to implement that new technology from Shadow, that company called Shadow, which now is appropriately named. And like, I think the database from the DNC conflicted with the Iowa Democratic Party. So I know early on the Iowa Democratic Party kind of looked like they were 100% responsible. But later, I believe it came out that the DNC was, I think a Politico article actually criticized the DNC for meddling in the Iowa caucuses. Is that about right?
Yes. And there are some Iowa Democrats really feel like the DNC sandbagged them on this. A lot of people don't remember that in 2019, the Iowa Democratic Party had this whole plan to do a virtual caucus, and it was going to be much more accessible than ever before. Right. And they were working on this for the better part of the year. And then the DNC shot that down in September of 2019 with only 4 months to go before the caucus. And all of a sudden, the Iowa Democratic Party had to come up with this plan B. And so this app ended up being the plan B. And they had presidential preference cards that were a new thing. They had to report the results differently. And yes, there were people at the DNC that were involved in sourcing that app, but it wasn't very well thought out, and it wasn't very well planned. And you can't pin all of that on the Iowa Democratic Party. Right. But I feel, and I wrote on my website over the weekend, that along the way, the Iowa Democratic Party had a lot of opportunities to reform the caucuses, to make them more transparent and more accessible. And we never did that because we always wanted to have this united front with New Hampshire, and we're paying the price for that now. But imagine if before the 2016 caucus, if we had moved to something more like a straw poll, which is basically what Republicans do at their caucuses, and just reported the numbers. Here's how many people showed up for Hillary. Here's how many people showed up for Bernie. And I think that would have removed at least one part of the criticism. The criticism of people still having to be at a specific place and time, that would still have been relevant, because shift workers and people with disabilities and caregivers and all kinds of other people can't necessarily be at their precinct caucus. But at least the results would have been clear. We had 2 caucuses in a row where the results weren't handled very well, and it didn't help.
Yeah, now that's a good point. I want to go back to something you said briefly with their last minute, though. I wasn't familiar with this, but you mentioned the Iowa Democratic Party was working on some digital aspects. So, I mean, isn't that kind of their attempt in making it more accessible that the DNC railroaded?
Yes, there were problems with the virtual caucus plan, but there was a virtual caucus plan rolled out relatively early in 2019. There was kind of an absentee opportunity. I mean, the delegates were capped for the absentee voter. So it still disadvantaged people who weren't physically present in their caucuses. But it was something. They were trying to respond to that criticism that the caucuses weren't accessible. And then there were concerns on the DNC. There were concerns that, well, this virtual caucus thing could be hacked or it could be manipulated. And I read different things from cybersecurity experts. That's not my field. And I saw some people say this was a valid concern and other people say this was just a pretext. So I don't know. But in any case, the DNC decided in September of 2019, which is pretty late in the game before the 2020 caucuses, nope, you can't do this virtual caucus. And the party had spent months and months planning that and starting to train the precinct chairs and the county chairs on it. And all of a sudden they had to come up with something different, which ended up being this app.
So should we save the Iowa caucuses, Laura? Should we try?
I'm going to miss the Iowa caucus.
You and me, we're going to do it.
I do understand. I understand why the Democratic Party is looking elsewhere. And I think that it's hard to let go of my attachment. I loved being at my precinct caucus. I loved seeing the presidential candidates. But I think that for a lot of people on the DNC have valid reasons to try to make the primary field more diverse and more accessible. And that's what they're doing.
Laura and I are going to save the caucuses, everybody. It's just going to be me and you against the world. Laura Belin.
I'll still be there. I'll be at my precinct voting for who's going to be on the platform committee and the central committee, but it just won't be the caucuses that we're all used to.
Don't lose hope, Laura. Laura Belin, the publisher and editor of Bleeding Heartland. Give that website out one more time, Laura.
At www.bleedingheartland.com, and I am on Twitter at Laura R. Belin.
Awesome. Laura, thank you so much for coming on the Iowa podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa podcast.